Welcome to my next episode of Great War Story, and it's another post-Great War story. I made a short little video the other day about my grandfather responding to his summons to parade when he was 70 years old, and that got me thinking about my grandfather's post-war experiences. So I'm making a more substantial one today, and I've called it I Get Knocked Down, I Get Back Up Again, because that really was my grandfather. Like, if you go through his life, the things that he suffered. His mother died before his first birthday, so he never knew his mother. He had two older sisters. One of those died when she was 9 years old. He went all the way through World War I, 1914 to 1919, suffered measles, influenza, bursitis. He was shot in the shoulder, that shot through the face. He lost his farm because it just wasn't viable that he was given as part of that scheme to make soldier settlers. He lost his farm and had to walk away from that. He then tried being a grocer in Christchurch and lost that business. And though not mentioned here was when he lost his wife, my grandmother, when she was just about 60. So he suffered a lot of blows. And in many ways, he's an inspiration to me and an inspiration, I think, to us all about how if you get knocked down, you just get back up again and you get back to it. And therefore, the subtitle, I think, is very appropriate for my grandfather. Hard times make great men. So I mentioned briefly in the last episode, the last time he wore his uniform was when he was on this wagon heading to Middlemarch as part of the soldier settler scheme. And there's some more images of what Middlemarch was like. It was a pretty small, nothing town with very basic services, and it cannot have been an easy life, even while he was still there, struggling to make the farm, well, make a go of it, which ultimately, as I said, he was forced to give up on. There's an aerial shot of what it looks like today. You can see it's still not exactly what a major metropolis. And so, as I said briefly already, after having been forced to walk off the farm, they moved to Christchurch, the biggest city in the South Island of New Zealand, and tried to open a grocery business. And the short version there is, he got scarlet fever, and the business failed. So that attempt to make Christchurch work was also a failure, and he had to try something else. Now, I've quoted in a few episodes before my Uncle Duncan's family history, and I've criticized his section about my grandfather's World War I experience as being wildly inaccurate, but the later portions I trust more because it's, well, the portions where he's describing his own recollections, his own experiences. Uncle Duncan was a lot older than my grandmother. My grandmother wasn't born until after my grandfather moved. My mother wasn't born until after my grandfather moved to Wellington, but Uncle Duncan was roughly 20 years older than my mother, and so he had, well, memories that go a lot farther back. And here's what he commented about their time in Christchurch. It is very likely that it was during the period immediately after this experience that our parents began to look for some better way of making a living. Bruce had become interested in something that was very new to New Zealand. It was radio, which was still very much in its infancy and almost unheard of in the average home. Dad had one of the first cat's whisker sets to be seen in Christchurch. It had a small horn speaker and was tuned by moving the knob which controlled the position of the cat's whisker against a small piece of crystal. Elementary indeed, but a source of great wonder and interest to those who listened to the announcer's voice or the music, apparently coming from nowhere. It certainly caused a lot of excitement when he demonstrated it behind the counter of his shop. It seems very hard for us to imagine a world where radio was this incredibly rare new novelty, and it, well, takes me back to my youth when in 1982 one of my older brothers bought a ZX81 computer and brought it home. And in 1982, That was amazing. We had a computer, an actual computer in our house. I mean, it was astonishingly primitive by today's standards, but at the time we knew exactly one person who had a computer in their house, and his was a work computer because he was programming and used it for work purposes. I mean, normal people did not have computers in their homes, and I guess that's what radio was like back then. The long spell of isolation in the fever hospital seriously affected the viability of the business, and he was becoming convinced that there was a great future for radio. He became busy teaching himself the basic principles of wireless and how to build them. This led him into an opening in this field. It is unclear just how he managed it, but he made contact with a large timber and hardware firm, C&A Odlin, in Wellington. They were just becoming interested in the import of an American radio set made by the firm known as Atwater Kent. America was already well advanced in radio technology, and their make of radio was becoming well known over there. Now you'll see, even though it's still called the Timber and Hardware Store, or hardware company rather, you can see on that photo they're advertising Mullard radios. So that was clearly a major sideline for them. And why Mullard and not Atwater Kent, I'll explain that later in this episode. The prospects must have appeared to be worthwhile, and our father never lacked courage, because soon after our parents set about making plans to move to Wellington and a new life there. So there's Christchurch at the bottom, if you are not familiar with New Zealand geography, and Wellington, the capital, is at the bottom of the North Island. And they, went from Christchurch to Wellington. Now, these days, most New Zealanders would assume that you'd drive up to the top of the South Island and get the inter-island ferry across. But back at this stage, there was actually a regular passenger service between Lyttelton, the port of Christchurch, and Wellington, and they sailed up to Wellington on the steamship Maori. And there's some Wellington suburbs. Our father had applied for a position with a well-established timber and hardware firm of C&A Odlin Limited, and he was able to commence work almost as soon as he arrived in Wellington. Little did he realize what a tough time he was going to have in this new field of radio, especially as the Depression years developed. These early radio sets normally had three components: the radio receiver itself, the speaker, and the transformer. The latter was necessary to reduce our local power from 230 volts to 110 volts, which was the normal voltage in America where they were made. All these components were extremely heavy, and Wellington, with its many homes situated either up or down extremely steep paths, this became a major problem, and during the holidays my father was always grateful to have me go with him on his rounds, to assist by carrying one or other of the components. And certainly in my family holidays going to Wellington, it's very hilly. And even when we visited Grandad, it was down a steep driveway and things like this. And oh yeah, that's very much Wellington. If you ever visit it and get out of the central city, which is built on the only flatland available, all of the suburbs are just built on hills which were never meant to be so heavily occupied. There were only a few local broadcasting stations, and everyone wanted to hear at least one of the American stations, which could only be received late at night, because they didn't broadcast 24 hours a day. This meant long hours for the salesmen who were demonstrating their receivers. The average home could not afford a radio in those days, and consequently most of the sales were being made in the more affluent areas, where doctors, lawyers, and successful business people had residence. These same customers tended to be more than a little demanding, and it was not unusual to find 2 or 3 salesmen in the same hours at a very late hour, all attempting to convince the prospective customer that their radio would receive the favorite American station KFI Los Angeles. And I looked it up and was fascinated to learn that KFI Los Angeles is still in existence. It's an AM radio station, not FM, and I don't think I ever listened to AM radio, but I'm going to have to tune my bandwidth since I live in Southern California and see if I can pick up 640 AM. And for those who live in Southern California, you will recognize the name iHeartMedia. Yes, it's part of the iHeartRadio empire. KFI was in fact founded in, I think, 1921 and started broadcasting in 1922, and it's still going. It's past its 100th anniversary. Wonder how many radio stations there are in the world that have been a going concern for more than 100 years. Our father worked very hard and was out almost every night of the week, but he usually managed to be with us most weekends. I can well remember our father coming home one day and telling our mother that he had received a rise in his salary to £400 a year. The significance of this amount escapes me, but it must have been of some importance to them at the time. I think it was about then that things were finally starting to come right for them. And because the radio business was expanding so rapidly, Odlins decided to open a retail store in the central city. And my grandfather, who had been obviously doing well in the company with the radio business, was given the position of manager, and he had several employees working under him. And this retail store was in the T&G building in Lambton Quay, one of the major streets of downtown Wellington. And in fact, it's still there today, but that's what it looks like in some historic photos. And that's what it looks like, well, more or less today. So it's one of those nice old buildings that's actually stood the test of time and is still there. And in fact, my grandfather did so well in the store that ultimately he bought it out, and it was no longer Odlins. It was in fact R.B. Fowler Radio and Electrical. So finally his dream of being his own boss, well, he had tried many times. He had tried being his own boss on the farm, hadn't worked. He had tried being his own boss with a grocery store, hadn't worked. Had to swallow his pride and become an employee, but he was able to turn it around and become a successful business owner. And I was delighted when I was searching through historic Wellington newspapers to find many of the advertisements for his store and the products he was selling. The earliest I was able to find was May 1932, so I imagine it must be about that time that he had taken over the store and made it R.B. Fowler. And these advertisements are quite fascinating. So here's the first one that I've managed to locate. Announcing the amazing Model 96. More valves than ever, with the big daytime wallop. Hear at once this new Atwater Kent, and then nothing else in radio will satisfy you. Daytime range and volume and beauty that electrifies you. Purity that startles with its naturalness at all hours of the day. And see this newest idea, the neon tuning light. No more complicated fiddling with knobs. When the light is at its maximum height, you are dead on the station you want. And then you can adjust your tone and volume. This Model 96 has excited the experts. 8-valve superhet, variable mu and pentode valves, perfected volume control, adjustable tone control, a static reducer and fading eliminator, improved dynamic speaker. New sensitivity switch for maximum performance from either local or distant stations. The Atwater Kent radio. And then the next one. New daytime wallop is the biggest thrill that radio has yet given me. Radio's leadership improves still further. Daytime reception that thrills, electrifies. You never heard its like before. And see the new neon tuning light. Bing! Puts you right on any station you want. Model 96. Not just ahead, miles ahead. Still more valves. Neon tuning light. The Atwater Kent radio. And then clear as crystal. Yes, they've got punch. These new Atwater Kent models that everyone is talking about. But here's the amazing thing. Even when the power almost overwhelms you, the tone is pure, true, clear as crystal. Listen to one and get the thrill of your life. Ask to hear Model 90/567 compact 7-valve superhet, variable mu and pentode valves, adjustable tone control, static reducer and fading eliminator, etc., etc. Other models to suit your taste and purse. Atwater Kent radio, but get it from R.B. Fowler, opposite Kelburn Tram, Lambton Quay. And then we have this one, the Sport of Kings. Follow it from your fireside. Maybe you can't get to your favorite sports meetings. Don't worry. Atwater Kent will bring them to you. Now that yay stations are broadcasting running commentaries on the big meetings, it behoves you more than ever to put yourself in the centre of things with an Atwater Kent. Every latest feature in radio, glorious trouble-free reception, year after year, thrilling purity of tone, and Atwater Kent ruggedness and value. Get it from R.B. Fowler. Oh, I can't stop. These are too good. A Merry Christmas. That's how to make sure of it. This Christmas, why not pull all your family presents into one and give the house a new 1933 matchless Atwater Kent? From small compact to magnificent 12-valve deluxe console, there's an Atwater Kent model exactly suited to your purse. The new Atwater Kents will amaze you with their livelier tone, greater distances, richer power, perfect selectivity and sensitivity. They're just matchless. There's nothing in all radio to equal them. Enjoy the gift that continually gives. And get it, don't forget, from R.B. Fowler in the T&G Buildings, Lambton Quay. This, however, is my all-time favourite of all of his advertisements. Good evening. Have you realized what pleasure you are missing when you don't own a radio? Now, again, I've commented on this already on this episode, but once more, it's so hard to imagine a world where people don't have radios. Poor people can't afford them. It's a luxury for the rich. And this just summarizes it in one glorious sentence. Have you realized what pleasure you're missing when you don't own a radio? Well, get the all-electric 4-valve local receiver, full dynamic speaker and standard power pack, installed for £14 and 10 shillings. We also have a few electric sets for just £12 10 shillings from R.B. Fowler. Now, notice that talks about the installation. It wasn't just something you went and you purchased it and took it home and plugged it in and it works. No, these were much more complicated. They needed large aerials to pick up these overseas stations and things like this. And Wellington, well, they don't call it Windy Wellington for nothing. These large aerials had to be well secured from the strong winds and things like this. So you needed a professional installation. I'm trying to think of a modern equivalent. More like when you buy an air conditioning unit or something that has to be professionally installed. That's what you're talking about when you buy a radio. And then there's this one. Additional electric points are most useful. We install extra points. All electric receiver. Just think, only a plug to slip in. Easy to operate. So that's another thing you have to remember. Houses back then weren't built properly electrified. Like we're used to the idea you buy a house and every room will have electric plugs in it. And modern houses have even more than the old ones used to. But back then, a house often wouldn't have many or any at all, so they would have to be installed. So my grandfather's business expanded beyond radios to doing, a lot of this kind of electrical work, and there was a fair bit of demand for the installation of power plugs. And then electric radiators, warm friends for chilly days. We have them from, was that £12, 6 shillings, I guess. Extra points installed. R.B. Fowler, electrical dealer. They also expanded into lighting, and in later years they actually were installing quite a lot of commercial lighting in shops and factories and things like that in the central city. Now, when I look at these two particular advertisements, I can't help feeling that the woman in these adverts looks a lot like my grandmother. And well, I don't know for sure, but it very well may not be a coincidence. I wonder who did these drawings, and did my grandfather ask that the woman in the ads be made to look like his wife? Well, it's quite possible. And then October 1935. What? An Atwater Kent all-wave for £1 down and 5 shillings per week? To think of being able to buy an Atwater Kent radio, the recognised world leader, and an all-wave model too, for such astonishing low terms, seems too good to be true, but it is true. The console and compact models here shown are 5-valve all-wave with airplane dish, 2-speed tuning, handsome cabinet. Yes, £1 down and 5 shillings per week buys either of these. Now, that's the cash price, the total price, £19 for the compact, £22 for the console, including royalty. And remember, this is the Great Depression right now. I guess they were forced to offer terms like this because otherwise people wouldn't have been able to buy one. And again, like they, again, it's such a different world. Like in the year 2023, you go into a store and you buy a radio. I mean, frankly, it'd be kind of probably quite hard to just buy a radio that didn't do anything else. But the idea that to buy a radio, you had to make a down payment and then make weekly payments on it, it just boggles the mind. Yes, we've changed to Zenith. The difference is astounding. Zenith brings the human voice and instruments too, right to your home, with the breathtaking realism of the studio itself. Sets only a year old are being changed to Zenith. See the new Zenith, hear the new Zenith, and you too will understand why. Everybody's changing to Zenith. Well, why were they changing to Zenith? Because Atwater Kent went bankrupt. Why they went bankrupt, I don't know. They seem to be doing rather well in New Zealand, and my grandfather certainly did well out of them, but he couldn't get them anymore, so my grandfather had to shift over to selling a different brand, and Zenith was the brand, another American brand. And, well, that caused some major readjustments because there were different valves and different spare parts and all sorts of things. So he had to retrain and re-equip his shop with Zenith and all of the spare parts that were required, because a lot of the Atwater Kent valves and so on were now effectively worthless for anything other than repairs of old sets. And here we have models from £15, 15 shillings, easy terms arranged, home demonstration arranged, call on R.B. Fowler. And there's another shot of Lambton Quay. Then there were the parking problems. This is my uncle talking. And as he got older, he started to work longer hours at my grandfather's shop. And later still, my Auntie Eleanor started working there as well. So he started to have more and more exposure to the business and working in the central city. So this is back to Uncle Duncan. Then there were the parking problems that we suffered in the city. The city council traffic officers used to mark the tyres on parked cars and issue tickets if they were left too long in the same place. That was the most inconvenient for us, but we had a happy arrangement with the officers, and they used to quietly sneak into the rear of the shop for morning and afternoon tea. It was an ideal setup, and the cost of chocolate biscuits well worthwhile. Now, for Americans listening to this, I have to explain that a biscuit is not the savory scone-like thing. A biscuit is what an American would call a cookie. And knowing my family, I suspect that those chocolate biscuits were not shop bought. They were probably made at home. And I found a picture of one of those kinds of chocolate biscuits. They're called chocolate Afghans. And in fact, to my surprise, when I looked them up on Wikipedia, I found out that they're a New Zealand specialty. I well remember my mother making them. And they're usually something I encountered as home baking, but they were sold commercially. And then in 2020, as part of this great wave of having to rename everything because everything was suddenly racist, they decided that the name Chocolate Afghan was racist for some reason, even though nobody actually knows why they're called Afghans. They thought that it was possible maybe that the color of the biscuit and the darker color of people who live in Afghanistan were somehow related, and therefore it was racist. So nope, you can't call them Afghans anymore. Well, I don't care, I'm still calling them Afghans, and I'm sure everybody in New Zealand who still makes them still call them Afghans, whatever the business decided. But it did remind me of another story, because there's another New Zealand specialty, which again I remember my mother making frequently, and they used to be called German biscuits. But World War I came along and you couldn't call them German biscuits anymore, so they got renamed Belgian biscuits. And when my mother made them, she made Belgian biscuits. I didn't even know that they used to be called German biscuits until I read about it in a history book. So I guess this whole fetish for renaming everything is not exactly new because it happened in World War One. So chocolate Afghans can't be called chocolate Afghans anymore, apparently. And well, I never even knew that German biscuits had been renamed because I grew up just calling them Belgian biscuits. That was my reality. Then a further quote from my Uncle Duncan's history. Then there were the regular customers who made an appearance each week in order to pay their installment on a radio or some other appliance that they had bought on hire purchase. They normally stopped for a chat, and some of them were real characters. One who's particularly well remembered was a fiery foreign immigrant named Joe Barclay. He would sometimes arrive just a little the worse for wear, which probably means drunk. He would sometimes arrive just a little the worse for wear, and Dad, who took strong exception to alcohol and bad language, would have words with him. He must have respected Dad, because he remained a customer for many years, and much later Joan and I would employ him when we built extensions to our home in Karori. Now, I couldn't actually find a suitable photo of somebody looking somewhat rough and perhaps a bit drunk, but I did find this photo from Wellington, and this fellow, I'm slandering him by implying that he might be drunk. It was actually in context a demonstration of windy Wellington when the winds were blowing so incredibly strong, this guy was having to lean into the wind and hold his hat. But for this episode, I'm using him to represent this fellow, Joe Barclay, and when he would appear in the shop, somewhat inebriated. And that photo, by the way, is Wellington from about that time period. Now, on to the next one. Because if you look carefully at this advertisement, you will notice that the address has changed. He's no longer on Lambton Quay because they outgrew that and they decided to relocate their business to elsewhere in Wellington, and they moved to 78 Manor Street. Now, I would love to show you a photo of the building they're in, but I can't because it's been knocked down and it's like a bit of a mini shopping mall arcade thing. And I think there might be like a KFC or something stupid in the location where his shop used to be. And here they're now selling Mallard radios. Now, why Mallard? I promised you a little bit earlier in this episode that I'd explain that. Well, it was economic protectionism during the Great Depression. Atwater Kent and what was the other brand? I can't even remember what it was called now. If we skip back, we can get it pretty quick. Where was it? Zenith, that's right. Atwater Kent and Zenith were American made. And they decided that they shouldn't be helping American businesses anymore. So they basically put tariffs on the American radios. So my grandfather couldn't get Zenith anymore, and he had to go to an imported model from Britain. Well, New Zealand was a royal colony, and they weren't going to be putting tariffs and restrictions on British radios after all. So my grandfather once again had to change over and re-equip his shop with a whole new set of equipment and all new kinds of valves and spare parts and all of the rest. And you can see what it says down the bottom there. Now at 78 Manor Street, almost opposite the Regent Theatre, and there's the Regent Theatre, and wherever this photographer, when he took it, is standing almost opposite Regent Theatre. So I would love it if he had just turned a little bit to his right and taken some more photos. Sadly, he did not, and I don't have any photos of my grandfather's shop in Wellington, but who knows, maybe one day one will turn up. And there's another shot of Manor Street, and that one on the left is actually my mother as a little girl, and she recalls going to visit her father's shop, and I rather like that one. You can see the smile there, and it looks a bit more natural perhaps than many other photos you see. Even that interesting fellow walking along with a bit of a, one hand in his pocket, and he's got a bit of a sway to his step. Look at him. I wonder who that guy was who was walking along the street just behind my mother. And then Uncle Duncan continues, we prided ourselves on the standard of the window displays, and many of them were really original. At one time, an innovative radio was produced as the armchair model. We featured this in the window, complete with a dressed-up dummy smoking a pipe, enjoying his evening drink. Well, I couldn't find a photo of a shop display like that, but this is in fact a shop display for selling Atwater Kent radios, so it'll do in the place of well, what my uncle and grandfather put together in their shop window. Not so good for business was the time when a riot occurred in the city, and a gang of roving troublemakers smashed shop windows. Before the police were able to regain control, in common with many others, our windows were boarded up at night for some time until the trouble was over. One experience of cleaning up broken glass was more than enough. Now, I'm not sure, but I suspect that he's actually referring to the Manners Street riot of 1943 that actually involved GIs, US troops who were there for World War II. Now, I've read a lot of conflicting reports about exactly what happened in the Manners Street riot, and this one on the right is actually it's an ad for Coca-Cola, and it's showing an American GI showing off his, eagle, tattoo on his chest, and you've got a Maori showing off his Maori tattoo on his chest, and you've got a, white New Zealand soldier standing in the middle, and they're all enjoying a Coke. Now, one of the stories is that the trouble was set off because the New Zealand Maori were, able to drink it and do everything that any other New Zealander was able to do, and that some of the troops from the south of the United States didn't want to drink in establishments that allowed, what should we say, dark fellas to drink there too, and that set off the riot. I've read other accounts that say that wasn't what happened at all. There's exaggerated accounts that say thousands were involved and 2 men were killed. That seems to be totally untrue. What the actual truth behind it all is, I honestly don't know, but there definitely was some kind of riot, and that may well be the occasion when my grandfather's shop windows got smashed up. Our father was quite a character. He stood no nonsense, and when a shoplifter was spotted, his reaction was immediate. We have seen him leap the counter on a busy Christmas Eve and chase one man right across Manners Street and into the public bar of the Regent Hotel opposite in order to recover an electric razor lifted from one of our display stands. I've said it before, I'll say it again. My grandfather was not a man to take nonsense from anyone. Now, I have a little bit of a digression here, but it will eventually come back to my grandfather. But bear with me while I go through and have a little bit of a rant about contemporary events on not learning the lessons of history. And as a history professor, let me say, I think the old line about how we tell people you should study history because, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. It's a terrible justification for telling people to study history, because let me tell you, we keep making the same mistakes again and again. We study history and people make the same stupid mistakes anyway. Maybe we should rephrase it. Study history so you can stand back and watch everybody else repeat the same mistakes again and again. So anyway, I live in California, as you know, and California has a electric vehicle mandate. Supposedly, all new cars sold in California are to be electric by 2035. Now, to give you an idea what a big ask that is, last year in 2022, 16% of cars sold in California were electric, and that's far ahead of the national average for the United States. I think nationally it was closer to 5%. I live in a fairly well-off neighborhood, and you see quite a lot of Teslas on the roads in my area, but also very noticeable. If you go to a poorer area, you won't see many Teslas or any other kind of EV at all. Now, in addition to that mandate and a whole bunch of other mandates that say that we're supposed to stop using any kind of fossil fuel to generate electricity. Well, what's been happening? Well, back in 2013, they closed down the San Onofre nuclear power station that we would drive past when we'd go down for a family trip to San Diego. And that leaves one single nuclear power plant still operating in California. In fact, it was due to close, was it this year or last year? About now, anyway. But they had a sudden attack of rationality, realizing that California simply can't generate enough electricity, and at least delayed the closing of the Diablo Canyon station until 2030. Now, not surprisingly, we are seeing these kind of headlines. California and the Midwest faced high risk of electricity shortages in the next 5 years. Yeah, and the next 5 years are going to be a lot better than the following 5 years, which are going to be a lot better than the 5 years after that. And then another story. Can California's power grid handle a 15-fold increase in electric cars? Well, the answer is no, it can't. And a quote from that particular story: "We're going to have to expand the grid at a radically much faster rate," said David Victor, a professor and co-director of the Deep Decarbonization Initiative at UC San Diego. "This is plausible if the right policies are in place, but it's not guaranteed. It's best case." Now, you can tell from the job and type and initiative that David Victor's involved with that he very much favors this move. And yet, let's keep reading. Yet the Energy Commission has not yet developed such policies or plans, drawing intense criticism from energy experts and legislators. So even the most optimistic people are saying, yes, if everything goes in the right direction and we start right away and it's best case scenario, we might maybe just be able to get there. But the fact is, they haven't even started trying. It's a inevitable disaster that is seemingly inescapable because the incompetents running our state just couldn't organize their way out of a paper bag. Now, to give you an idea of just how serious it is, here is the 2018 total system electric generation. And you can see here, while coal was not generating an awful lot of power for California, hydro was only managing to get less than 11.5% of California's electricity needs. Natural gas, on the other hand, was 46.5%, and nuclear was almost 10%. That's going to be very hard to replace. Now, especially noticeable, however, are electricity imports. California already cannot generate enough electricity to meet its needs. So you can see here that 31% of California's 2018 electrical consumption wasn't actually generated in California. We had to buy it from other states such as Arizona and Utah, and that was in 2018. And just in case you're wondering, this information doesn't come from some ultra-conservative website or anything like this. These are numbers straight from the California Energy Commission. And then let's look at a different assessment: independent statistics and analysis from the US Energy Information Administration. California imports more electricity than any other state and typically receives between 1/5 and 1/3 of its electricity supply from outside the state. In 2022, in-state utility scale electricity generation equaled about 4/5 of California electricity sales, and the rest of the state's supply came from out of state. In 2021, renewable energy generated 31% of energy's imported electricity, and large hydroelectric sources supplied another 16%. So their dream of going entirely renewable, if they're going to be honest about it, they have to factor in how the electricity is being generated that they're buying from other states as well, because California is already by far the biggest importer of electricity, which means, of course, that this catastrophic course that California is following is going to have a huge impact on states like Arizona and Utah. Mind you, it'll probably be quite beneficial for them because it means California will have to pay through the nose for any electricity they're willing to sell us. Now, it's not just California, mind you. Germany faces $1 trillion challenge to plug massive power gap. About 250 gigawatts of new electricity capacity are needed by 2030. Germany needs 43 soccer fields of solar power every day to meet that, which is never going to happen, of course. There's just not enough land, there's not enough capacity, and they're not doing it. This dream that wind power and solar power can replace coal and natural gas and all these other things for generating it is just a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. Certainly it's not going to happen by the 2030s. And then, well, other countries are quick to take advantage, just like Arizona and Utah benefit from California's foolishness. Well, Poland moves forward with country's first nuclear power plant. I believe the Czechs have built a bunch of them just next to the German border because they know any excess capacity is just revenue because the Germans are going to have to buy from them. Now, New Zealand has been walking down the same path. New Zealand pledges to phase out coal for electricity in the next 10 to 20 years. Huntly coal-fired power plant should have been closed in 2018, and it had better have happened by 2030, Baxter said. Genesis Energy has said it will stop using coal under normal hydrological conditions by 2025, with the intention to phase coal out completely by 2030. What this means is it's not going to happen. All of these mandates they had in New Zealand for clean energy, they stopped any kind of exploration for natural gas offshore of New Zealand. And the net result was when there wasn't enough rainfall and the dams for all the hydroelectric power stations were running low on water, suddenly they had to fire up a coal plant. And in fact, because they'd killed any domestic coal industry, they imported filthy coal. And the net result of New Zealand's clean green energy policy was a massive increase in pollutants and global warming emissions, etc., etc. So much for that. The problem New Zealand has, of course, is that it doesn't have a Utah or Arizona sharing a land border. Well, actually, Utah doesn't share a land border, but with California, but you get the idea. Like Germany has Poland or the Czech Republic to fall back on when they make these foolish mistakes. New Zealand is an isolated country in the South Pacific. It doesn't have anywhere else to buy electricity from. So the inevitable result are going to be blackouts, mass energy shortage. It's such an inevitable problem in the future that when it happens and all the politicians are going, well, we never realized it would be this serious, they're either fools or they're lying. Well, when it comes to politicians, they're probably fools and they're lying, but, well, what can you do? And here's a photo getting back to my grandfather's story, talking about when this has happened before, New Zealand's power crisis in the 1950s, and the quote which accompanied this photo. Power cuts, common after the Second World War, made New Zealanders return to old habits and take on new ones. This photograph shows people queuing to buy kerosene lamps during power restrictions in 1956. Now, New Zealand had fairly limited power generation. This is a photo I took on a holiday near Queenstown in the South Island of the Roaring Meg hydropower station that was built in the 1930s. It had limited capacity, but it was enough for New Zealand at that time. But as you can already tell from my grandfather's business, selling radios, installing electric plugs, installing lighting, selling heating systems and all the rest, there was a major surge in demand for electricity, and New Zealand's ability to generate enough, well, it just couldn't keep up. Now, this is from Engineering New Zealand. In the post-war years, the anticipated explosion in the use of electricity took place, and the next 30 years saw an 11-fold increase in the capacity of the generating system, from 500 megawatts to 5,600 megawatts. The problem was they didn't get started soon enough. Yes, they managed to have a surge in production, but the 1950s was a time of crisis because the planners didn't get it right. Skipping down to the second paragraph. Critically important events during this period were the power crisis of the early 50s, when serious shortfalls in supply created shutdowns and blackouts throughout the country. These were a regular occurrence in the years between 1954 and 1957 and gave rise to great public concern, which was fully recognized by the government of the day. Further programs then had to be started. Now, let me give you an example of how these things work. The Roxburgh Dam as a case study. So in 1944, there is clear documentary evidence that the government was aware that there was a looming power shortfall and something was going to have to be done. It took them until December of 1947 to actually give approval to build this power station because, hey, looming imminent crisis, let's wait 3.5 years. And from when they approved it to when it actually got completed and started generating electricity was another 9 years, well, 8.5 years perhaps. And this is the reality of building major power infrastructure. It doesn't happen quickly. If you need a new power station right now, well, tough luck, because it's not going to be ready for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Any power demands that California has, any power demands that New Zealand has in the year 2033, should we say, 10 years from now, you better be breaking ground on the new power plants today. If you're not, it's not going to be ready for another year or 2 years. And the fact of the matter is, New Zealand and California and Germany and so many others, they seem to think that electricity comes out of a plug in the wall, like it's magic fairy dust or something. They don't seem to have an understanding of the incredible and major infrastructure behind it, and just how long it takes to add new capacity. Now, the initial government estimate was that it was going to cost £11.5 million to build this dam. Would anybody care to hazard a guess how much it ended up costing? Well, if you guessed a number more than double that figure, you're on the money. Yes, it actually cost £24 million. And that, again, is pretty much par for the course with any major infrastructure project that the government of New Zealand or California or Germany or any of these other countries that are messing up their energy policies. That's the reality of what it's going to pay. Whatever estimate you hear about what it's going to cost, double it and add a bit more, and then at least hopefully you'll be in the ballpark. Now, what's actually even more concerning is that hydroelectric dams don't last forever. Let me read this quote that I got from this website about the mighty Clutha. The Roxburgh Dam will probably be the first large concrete gravity dam to be decommissioned in New Zealand. The obvious question is when. In 2007, Contact Energy was granted consents to continue operating its dams on the Clutha River for another 35 years. It seems highly unlikely that the reservoir will remain viable until 2042. The most likely scenario is that another major flood will prompt an investigation into the decommissioning issue, but probably only after further significant damage occurs. A major earthquake could also hasten this process. You see, dams silt up, and even with deliberate flushing and dredging and other things, there comes a certain point where they're no longer viable and the dam will have to be removed. Will they be able to rebuild another dam in the same location? Well, add another 10 years for that. But my strong suspicion is that with the strong environmental movement and clean green policies and all the rest, it will be politically impossible to build a new dam. So they'll remove this dam and it won't be replaced. And hey, there goes another piece of significant energy generation, just like California and Germany decommissioning their nuclear power plants. Well, New Zealand is going to have to decommission some of its hydroelectric dams. And, well, as I said, they don't come fast. And there were a whole series through the 1970s and 1980s building more and more hydroelectric dams. But I think since they finished the Clyde Dam, that I think was the last of the major dams. And this is another one of my holiday snaps from that holiday I had down in the South Island. So New Zealand has already probably reached or passed peak capacity for hydroelectric, but demand for electricity keeps increasing, and with the mandates for electric vehicles, the demand is going to go up and up and up, and New Zealand will be facing a situation just like New Zealand was facing back in the 1950s. Now, what was the impact on my grandfather, Robert Bruce Fowler? Well, first let me read this piece from a New Zealand newspaper story, Shop Lighting at Night. Although shop window lighting is prohibited at night during power restrictions, several shops still had lights on after 9 o'clock in the city area last evening, but in most of the premises men were working. When the engineer manager of the municipal electricity department was told of this, he said that the reason why some lights were on in the MED building was that cleaners were still working there. Other business houses with lights on might have been using their own standby plants, or lights might have been on because cleaners were using them. MED inspectors were checking all lighting every evening, and 2 inspectors were on duty last evening, he said. Yep, whenever you get a crisis, the Karens come out of the woodwork. Well, Karen is a new term. I prefer petty fascists myself. These busybodies who just love an opportunity to wag their fingers at other people, look down their noses and tell them what to do. Well, my grandfather was a smart man, and he realized something. If every other shop in downtown Wellington had its lights out, but my grandfather's shop had all its lights on, then where would everybody gather? They would gather where there was some illumination. So anything he put in his shop window would get wonderful advertising, because people would be standing around smoking or whatever they're doing, and just standing there chatting, staring at his products, and perhaps the next day they'd come in and buy something. And that is exactly what my grandfather set out to do. And I actually managed to find some verification for this family story, because I only ever heard it described by members of my family. And as I said before, I don't fully trust family stories. And I managed to actually find a record from the Wellington Government Archives. 80 Manor Street. Remember, his shop was at 78? 80 Manor Street, Generator House, from May of 1952. Description. Owner, R.B. Fowler and Son. Builder and owner. Application value £25. Floor area 36.5 feet. And what is it they're building? They're building a generator house. That's what my grandfather did. He built his own and installed his own generator so that his shop window could be lit up, powered by his own means, not off the grid, and therefore everything was good. Well, you'd think so. But remember those petty fascists? This is the story as it's told. Well, one of these Karens was terribly eager to tell Grandad off. He came storming into Grandad's shop, wagging his finger and his clipboard and telling of all the dire consequences and fines, and lecturing Grandad about how selfish he was being, and doesn't he care about the needs of the New Zealand public, and blah, blah, blah. And in short, he was saying, "Respect my authority! Respect my authority! I'm a small man, but I have power over you, and you have to listen to me." Well, you already know that my grandfather was not somebody to put up with fools and petty fascists. And my grandfather very politely invited the city inspector to follow him, took him to his generator, showed him what he had, showed him that he was in fact generating his own electricity, and he was not violating any New Zealand government rules by having his shop lights on at night. And then he told the petty fascist to get out of his shop and never dare to set foot in there again. Goodbye, sir. And that, as they say, was that. And there's a photo of Grandad years later. And you can see he's kind of got a smug look on his face, and there's Animal giving him a grin. And I just looked at that photo, and I could just imagine him telling the story to Animal and saying, "And that was the last I ever saw of him. He never came back and bothered me, I'll tell you that for nothing. So, my grandfather, a strong man who got knocked down many times, but came back strongly and did very well for himself, and nobody was going to push him around. And that is the end of this episode. Thank you for listening.